There are certain stories that stick with you long after the cameras stop rolling and the stage goes dark. They aren't always the loudest or the most dramatic ones. Often they're the quiet ones, the ones that whisper a profound truth about the human condition if you're just willing to listen past the noise. The case of a 22-year-old man named Leo was one of those. The file landed on my desk with a thud thick with emails and letters from a family at the absolute end of their rope. The label they'd slapped on their son was simple, brutal, and one I've seen 1,000 times: lazy, entitled, a failure to launch. His parents, Mark and Susan, painted a picture of a boy who had every advantage: good schools, a supportive home, financial security, and had chosen to squander it all. He'd graduated from a decent college with a business degree a year ago and hadn't filled out a single job application since. Not one. Instead, his days were spent in his childhood bedroom, lost in video games, emerging only for meals that his mother still cooked for him. He was, in their words, a parasite in his own home. They'd tried everything they said. They'd pleaded, they'd yelled, they'd threatened to kick him out, but every ultimatum dissolved into the same stagnant reality. They were funding the very life they claimed to despise. On paper, it was a classic case of enabling. You've seen it, I've seen it. A young adult so cushioned from the realities of the world that they have no incentive to face it. But when I watched the pre-interview tapes, something felt off. Mark and Susan were a storm of frustration and righteous anger. Their words were sharp, their disappointment palpable. They talked about their son as if he were a broken appliance, a failed investment. Then the camera would turn to Leo. He wasn't defiant, he wasn't arrogant, he was hollow. There was a profound stillness about him, a placid and almost disconnected expression in his eyes as he listened to his parents list his failings. It wasn't the smirk of a freeloader who'd figured out the system. It was the look of someone who had already surrendered. That's the first thing you learn in this line of work behavior, is a language. Every action and every inaction is telling you something. Leo's inaction was screaming. The world saw a lazy young man who refused to work. I saw a young man who was profoundly catatonically stuck. The central question wasn't, why won't he get a job? That's a surface-level question that leads to surface-level answers, like, he's lazy. The real question, the one that matters, was, what is the function of this behavior? What is he getting out of not trying? Because here's the truth about human beings. We don't do things for no reason. There is always a payoff. The payoff might be self-destructive. It might be illogical to an outsider, but it's there. For Leo, the payoff for staying in his room, for refusing to engage with the world, had to be greater than the pain of his parents' constant disappointment and his own mounting shame. My job was to figure out what that payoff was. When I first sat down with him backstage, away from his parents, the quietness I'd seen on the tape was even more pronounced. He spoke in clipped, non-committal sentences. He'd shrug. He'd say, "I don't know a lot." It was a verbal smokescreen, a wall of apathy designed to keep people out. But I'm patient. I've sat across from men who have done unspeakable things and stonewalled for hours. A 22-year-old's passive resistance wasn't going to be an issue. I didn't push him on the job front. He was expecting that. That was the battleground his parents had chosen, and he was dug into his trench. I changed the subject. I asked him about the video games he played. His eyes flickered with a little bit of life for the first time. He talked about the strategy, the worlds, the characters. In these digital worlds, he was competent. He was a hero. He had a purpose. He could control the outcome. If he failed, he could just hit reset. The real world doesn't have a reset button. That was the first clue: control. The real world felt out of his control, so he had retreated to a world where he was the one pulling the strings. This wasn't about laziness, this was about fear. But fear of what I started asking about his life before college, high school, middle school. I wanted to find the point where the narrative shifted, where the bright, capable boy his parents sometimes tearfully remembered became this ghost haunting their house. His grades had always been good, he said. Not spectacular, but good. He was on the chess team. He was quiet, but he had a few friends. It all sounded normal. Too normal. People who are this profoundly stuck usually have a fracture point somewhere in their history. I asked him, Leo, tell me about a time you felt really proud of yourself. A time you really put yourself out there and it paid off. He was silent for a long time. So long, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he told me a story about a science fair in the 10th grade. He'd worked for months on a project, a complex robotics build that was way beyond the scope of the assignment. He loved it. He poured everything into it. He talked about the circuitry, the coding, the late nights spent tinkering in the garage. His voice had an energy I hadn't heard yet. He was sure he was going to win. It was, he said, the one thing he felt was truly his. He got to the fair, set up his project, and it worked perfectly. He was on top of the world. Then during the judging, as he was demonstrating it for the panel, a kid from across the gym tripped over a power cord. It wasn't his cord, wasn't even close to his station, but it sent a surge through the school's electrical system. His project fizzled, smoked, and died, right in front of the judges. He couldn't get it to turn back on. It was a freak accident, utterly random. The judges were sympathetic, but they had to judge what they saw. He didn't even place. He told me the story with a flat effect, as if he were reciting a historical event that happened to someone else, but I could see the flicker of pain behind his eyes. To an adult, it sounds trivial. A science fair, big deal kid, life's tough, get a helmet, and that's exactly what his parents had told him. His father, Mark, had clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Well, son, that's just bad luck. You'll get 'em next time." His mother had been more focused on the social embarrassment, worried about what the other parents would think. They saw the event, but they completely missed the meaning. What Leo learned that day wasn't that he could lose. Everyone learns that. What he learned in a deep and visceral way was that his absolute best effort, the sum of his passion and intelligence, could be rendered meaningless by something completely random and outside of his control. It was a terrifying lesson for a 15-year-old to absorb. It created a core belief, a dangerous piece of internal logic that went something like this: effort does not guarantee success. In fact, the more you care, the more you invest, the more it hurts when an indifferent world snatches it away for no reason at all. So what's the logical, albeit maladaptive, solution to that problem? You stop trying, you stop investing, you stop caring. If you don't put any chips on the table, you can't lose any. This wasn't a conscious decision. It was a slow, insidious emotional retreat. He started doing just enough to get by in school. Why aim for an A when a B required less effort and carried less risk of disappointment? He quit the chess team the following year. He told his parents it was boring, but the truth was he'd lost a competitive match he felt he should have won, and the sting of that failure felt too familiar. It was easier to just not play. His retreat was so gradual that his parents barely noticed it at first. They just saw their ambitious son becoming average, and they didn't like it. This is where the escalation began. Mark, his father, was a classic pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of man. He'd built his own business from the ground up and believed that willpower was the answer to everything. He saw Leo's growing passivity not as a symptom of fear, but as a moral failing. He started with pep talks that were really just thinly veiled lectures about work ethic. When those didn't work, the lectures became more pointed. He'd bring up the sons of his friends who were star athletes or academic leaders. Every comparison was a small paper cut to Leo's already fragile sense of self-worth. Susan, his mother, took a different but equally damaging approach. Her fear was social. She was worried about appearances, about what the neighbors would think. Her encouragement was laced with anxiety. Leo, you have to try harder. You don't want people to think you're lazy, do you? They were trying to motivate him with the two things he was already drowning in: shame and fear. They thought they were holding up a mirror to his behavior, but they were actually reinforcing his core belief. In his mind, their criticism confirmed his fear. The world is a judgmental place, and if you step out of line, you will be punished. His bedroom, his video games became his sanctuary. In that controlled environment, he was safe from the random cruelty of a power surge, safe from his father's judgment and his mother's anxiety. College was a temporary reprieve. The new environment gave him a clean slate, but he stuck to the same script: do the minimum. He chose a business major because it was what his father wanted, what was expected. He had no passion for it. He went to class, turned in his assignments, and got a degree. He walked the stage, handed the diploma to his parents, and then he went home and retreated to his room. For Mark and Susan, this was the ultimate betrayal. They had paid for the education. They had held up their end of the bargain. Now it was his turn, and he was doing nothing. The arguments became a daily ritual. They'd start small. Susan would ask, "Did you look at any job postings today, honey?" And Leo's one-word answer, "No, what now?" would be the spark. Mark would overhear from the other room and come charging in. "What the hell is wrong with you? Do you expect us to support you forever?" The blame shifting was dizzying. Leo would accuse them of nagging him, of not understanding. They would accuse him of being ungrateful, throwing their sacrifices back in their faces. Nobody was listening. They were just exchanging salvos of pain. They cut off his allowance. He just stopped leaving the house entirely. They took away his car keys. He didn't want to go anywhere anyway. Every move they made to force him into the world only gave him more reason to hide from it. Their attempts to control him were failing because he had perfected the art of passive resistance. By doing nothing, he was in complete control. The family was in a state of paralysis, held hostage by Leo's inaction. And that's when they wrote to me. They didn't see a scared young man who had learned a devastating lesson about life. They saw a 22-year-old freeloader who was refusing to get a job, and they wanted me to fix him. When we got on stage, the dynamic I'd seen on tape played out in high definition under the studio lights. Mark and Susan were coiled springs of frustration, leaning forward, eager to plead their case to me and to the world. Leo sat between them, a human buffer zone, but he seemed to shrink into the chair, his posture a physical manifestation of his retreat from life. He wouldn't make eye contact with me, with his parents, or with the audience. His gaze was fixed on a point somewhere on the floor. As I expected, Mark came out swinging. He laid out the timeline of Leo's laziness, framing it as a conscious choice, an act of defiance. He talked about the money they'd spent on college, the opportunities Leo was squandering. Susan followed her voice, trembling with a mixture of anger and a mother's pain. She talked about the shame she felt, the excuses she had to make to relatives. "We just don't know what to do anymore, Dr. Phil," she said, her hands twisting a tissue. "It's like he's a stranger in our own house. He's chosen video games over his own family, over his own future." They painted a compelling picture, and to most people it would be an open and shut case. But they were describing the symptoms, not the disease. I let them talk for a good while, letting them empty the reservoir of their frustration. When they were done, a tense silence fell over the stage. All eyes were on me. I didn't look at Leo. I looked directly at Mark and Susan. "So let me see if I've got this straight." I began, my voice calm and even. "For the last year, you two have been yelling, pleading, threatening, and shaming him. You've criticized his choices, you've compared him to others, and you've told him in 100 different ways that he is a disappointment. Is that a fair summary?" Mark nodded emphatically. We had to. He wasn't listening. "Okay," I said, holding his gaze. "And what has been the result of that strategy? Has he filled out one application? Has he gone to one interview? Has he changed his behavior in any positive way whatsoever?" Susan shook her head, her eyes welling up. "No, nothing. It's only gotten worse." "Right," I said. "So the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. How's that working for you? Your strategy has been a total and complete failure. It hasn't motivated him, it has paralyzed him. At some point, you have to stop blaming the recipient of your failed strategy and start questioning the strategy itself. I could see the confusion on their faces. They had come here for me to co-sign their anger, to join team parents against their lazy son. I wasn't going to do that. The problem on this stage wasn't just Leo. It was the entire family system, a three-person dance of dysfunction where everyone was playing their part perfectly. I turned to Mark. Mark, you're a successful man. You believe in hard work and tangible results, and you look at your son and you see the opposite of yourself. You think you're giving him tough love, but what he hears is, you are not good enough. You will never be like me. You're not his cheerleader. You've become his #1 critic, and nobody on this planet performs well for their critic. Then I turned to Susan. And Susan, you're the loving mother who can't bear to see her son in pain. You say you want him out of the house, but you make his bed. You cook his favorite meals. You wash his clothes. You tell him to be a man with your words, but with your actions, you treat him like a child. Your love and your fear have created the most comfortable prison cell in the world for him. Why would he ever leave? He has a maid, a chef, and a roof over his head. And the only price of admission is that he has to endure a lecture every day. For him, that's a price he's willing to pay. They were stunned into silence. It was the first time anyone had turned the spotlight away from Leo and onto them. Then I turned to the young man sitting silently between them. Leo, I said, my voice softer now, I want to talk about a science fair, 10th grade. For the first time, he looked up at me. His eyes, which had been dull and lifeless, now held a spark of surprise and maybe a little bit of fear. His parents looked completely baffled. I recounted the story he'd told me backstage, the passion for the project, the months of hard work, the freak accident, the crushing random injustice of it all. I looked back at his parents. You remember that day you saw it as a minor setback, a lesson in bad luck. What you failed to understand is that for a 15-year-old boy who had poured his entire identity into that project, it was a defining trauma. He didn't just learn that you can fail. He learned that the world is arbitrary and cruel and that your very best effort can be wiped out in an instant for no reason at all. He learned that caring is dangerous. And every time you've yelled at him for not trying, every time you've told him he's lazy, you have been reinforcing that lesson. You've been proving him right. The stage was completely silent. Susan let out a small sob, putting her hand to her mouth. Mark just stared his face, a mask of dawning comprehension. I kept my focus on Leo. They think this is about not wanting a job. I don't think it is. I think this is about terror. You're not lazy, son. You're terrified. You're so afraid of failing again, of putting your heart into something only to have it ripped away, that you've decided the safest move is to not play the game at all. Because if you don't try, you can never truly fail, right? Tears began to stream down Leo's face. He nodded, unable to speak. It was the breakthrough, the simple, devastating truth spoken out loud for the first time. He wasn't a lazy freeloader. He was a prisoner of his own fear, a fear his parents had unknowingly fed and nurtured for years. That moment on stage was the turning point. It was as if a pressure valve had been released in the room. The anger and resentment that had defined the family dynamic for so long evaporated, replaced by a raw, painful vulnerability. Leo's tears weren't just for himself. They were the manifestation of years of unspoken fear and misunderstood pain. Susan moved toward him not to scold, but to comfort, putting a hand on his arm. He didn't pull away. Mark, a man who had clearly built his life around emotional fortitude, looked utterly lost. He wasn't a villain, he was a father who had been using the only tools he had, logic, pressure, expectation, to fix a problem that was never about logic in the first place. He had been trying to fix a broken motor when the problem was a broken heart. I didn't know, Mark stammered, looking from Leo to me and back again. I just thought he needed a push. I thought, if I pushed hard enough, he'd snap out of it. The science fair. It was just a high school thing. I never imagined it meant... His voice trailed off. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The damage wasn't in the event itself, it was in the interpretation. It was in the fact that Leo had experienced a profound emotional injury, and his primary caregivers had told him to just walk it off. "Mark, this isn't about blame," I said, keeping my tone steady. "Blame is a useless emotion. It keeps you stuck. This is about understanding. For 7 years, you've all been speaking different languages. Leo was speaking the language of fear, and you were answering in the language of disappointment. It was never going to work." I explained the concept of a cognitive distortion. Leo had taken a single painful event and created a universal rule from it. Effort is futile and dangerous. His brain, in an effort to protect him from future pain, had generalized that belief to cover everything. Getting a job wasn't just filling out an application, it was setting himself up for another science fair. An interview wasn't a conversation, it was a panel of judges ready to watch him fail. Every potential step forward was seen through the lens of that one random catastrophic moment. His inaction wasn't defiance, it was a deeply ingrained self-preservation strategy. "So what do we do?" Susan asked, her voice thick with tears. "How do we fix this?" "First you stop," I said. "You stop the lectures, you stop the threats, you stop the daily interrogations about job hunting. That strategy is dead. You have to create a new environment in your home. Right now, it's a war zone. It needs to become a safe harbor. He doesn't need a drill sergeant and a social secretary. He needs parents. He needs to know that his worth in your eyes isn't contingent on whether or not he has a W-2 form." Then I turned my full attention to Leo. The tears had subsided, but his face was open and receptive in a way it hadn't been before. The defensive wall was gone. "Leo, I hear you. I see you," I said, making sure he was looking right at me. "And your fear is real. It's valid. Your brain has been trying to protect you. But here's the hard truth. Your protector has become your jailer. This bedroom you're hiding in isn't a sanctuary. It's a cage you've built for yourself bar by bar. And the only person who has the key is you." I told him this wasn't going to be a quick fix. There was no magic wand. This was about rewriting a 7-year-old script in his head. It would require professional help, a therapist who specialized in anxiety and cognitive behavioral therapy. He needed to learn how to challenge that distorted core belief. He needed to learn how to separate the past from the present to understand that the fluke of a power surge in 10th grade has absolutely nothing to do with his ability to succeed as a 22-year-old man. It's going to be about taking baby steps, I explained. The goal right now isn't to get the corner office at some big corporation. The goal for next week might be just to research 3 companies you find interesting. Not apply, just research. The goal the week after that might be to update your resume. We have to create a series of small, manageable wins to show your brain a new reality. We have to give it new data that proves the old rule wrong. The new rule has to be effort can lead to success and failure is not a catastrophe, it's just feedback. I laid out a plan. Leo would begin therapy immediately. His parents' new job was to provide unconditional support, which meant asking, "How can we help?" instead of, "What have you done?" Their role had to shift from enforcers to allies. They also had their own work to do. They had to learn to manage their own anxiety and disappointment so they didn't project it onto their son. They needed to find a way to parent the adult child they had, not the one they thought they should have. The show ended not with a dramatic, tearful hug or a promise of a 6-figure job by Friday. It ended with a quiet, fragile sense of hope. It was an acknowledgement that the problem had been correctly diagnosed for the first time, and now the hard work of healing could begin. They left the stage as 3 individuals who had finally started to see each other clearly. After the show, I followed up as I always do. The first few weeks were rocky. Leo started therapy but was resistant at first. Old habits die hard. Mark and Susan struggled to back off. Their anxiety often got the better of them, and they'd slip back into old patterns of questioning and pressure. There were a few tense phone calls where I had to remind them to trust the process and give their son the space he needed to breathe. But then slowly things began to shift. Leo started to engage with his therapist. He did the work. He began to see the science fair not as a life sentence, but as a single chapter in a much longer book. He started by updating his resume. It took him a week, an act that would take most people an hour, but for him it was a monumental victory. His parents, following the plan, didn't ask if it was done. They just told him they were proud of him for taking that first step. That simple affirmation was more powerful than any lecture had ever been. A month later, he applied for one job. It was a low-stakes entry-level position he was overqualified for. He didn't get an interview. The old Leo would have seen that as confirmation of his worst fears and retreated for another year. But the new Leo, with the help of his therapist, was able to process it differently. It wasn't a catastrophe. It was just a rejection. It was data. He applied for another job, then another. His journey wasn't a straight line. There were days of self-doubt, days he stayed in his room and fell back into the familiar comfort of his video games. The difference was that these were now viewed as setbacks, not a permanent state of being. His parents, for their part, were learning a new dance. When Leo had a bad day, instead of coming at him with criticism, Susan would quietly ask if he wanted to talk, and Mark learned to just give him his space, trusting that he would find his footing again. The home, once a pressure cooker of expectation and disappointment, was becoming a place where it was safe to fail. And because it was safe to fail, it finally became safe to try. About 3 months after the show, I received an email from Susan. It was short, but it said everything. Leo had gotten a job. It wasn't a glamorous, high-powered business career. It was a position in the logistics department of a local shipping company. It was steady, it had benefits, and it was his. He had found it, applied for it, interviewed for it, and earned it, all on his own. Susan wrote that the biggest change wasn't the job itself, but the light that had come back into her son's eyes. He stood taller. He joined the family for dinner without being prodded. He talked about his co-workers, about the challenges of the new role. He was engaged. He was connected. He had rejoined the world. I often think about Leo's story because it's a powerful reminder of one of the most fundamental truths I know about people behavior is always driven by a deeper need. No one chooses to be paralyzed by fear. No one chooses to be a prisoner in their own home. Those are outcomes, not choices. They are maladaptive solutions to a problem that the person feels they cannot solve any other way. The world had labeled Leo as lazy, a simple dismissive tag that required no further thought. But lazy is a judgment, not a diagnosis. It's a word we use to describe a behavior we don't understand. The real problem was never a refusal to work. The real problem was a profound, untreated fear of failure. A fear that was born in a moment of public humiliation and then nurtured for years by well-intentioned parents who mistook a cry for help for an act of defiance. They were trying to build a fire by dousing it with water. They loved their son, of that I have no doubt, but their love was filtered through a thick lens of their own expectations and anxieties, and as a result, they couldn't see the real boy who was suffering right in front of them. This outcome, this quiet success, wasn't about me. It wasn't about some magic Dr. Phil moment on television. It was about creating a space where the truth could finally be spoken without judgment. It was about giving a family a new language to communicate with. They had been trapped in a feedback loop of pain, each person's behavior triggering the others, reinforcing the very problem they were trying to solve. The breakthrough on stage simply broke that loop. It allowed them to step back and see the machinery of their own dysfunction for the first time. Leo's story isn't about some grand dramatic transformation. It's about the slow, difficult, and courageous work of taking one small step and then another. It's about a young man who had to learn that his value as a human being was not tied to his successes or failures. And it's about parents who had to learn that true support isn't about pushing and pulling. It's about creating a safe space to land. This wasn't a failure to launch, it was a failure to communicate. Once they learned how to truly hear each other, the boy who had been stuck in his room for a year finally found the courage to walk out the door and start his own life, not because he was pushed, but because he finally believed he could. And that makes all the difference.